Colossians chapter 3, and I invite you to turn over there with me. Colossians chapter 3 describes this as the putting off and putting on. And most likely you are familiar with these verses, but beginning in verse 5, he mentions something to establish the thought, the idea, when he says, "Mortify therefore your members which are upon the earth, fornication, uncleanness, inordinate affection, evil concupiscence, and covetousness, which is idolatry." The idea there behind mortify is to put them to death, to literally to kill them, these things. He goes down in verse 8 and he says, "But now also ye also put off these things, anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy communication out of your mouth. Lie not one to another, seeing that ye have put off the old man with his deeds." And then in verse 10, you see a contrast. "And having put on the new man, which is renewed in knowledge after the image of him that created him, where there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcision nor uncircumcision, barbarian, Scythian, bond nor free, but Christ is all and in all." Look at what he says in verse 12. "Put on, therefore," put these things into practice, in other words, "as the elect of God, holy and beloved, bowels of mercy, kindness, humbleness of mind, meekness, long-suffering, forbearing one another, and forgiving one another. If any man have a quarrel against any, even as Christ forgave you, so also do ye." Look at how he concludes it, verse 14. "And above all these things, put on charity, which is the bond of perfectness." And so when we consider this, we think about putting off these things and putting on Christ is what is under consideration here. He also said in Ephesians chapter 4, he described it in Ephesians chapter 4 as the old life as opposed to the new life. And again, a great description, but beginning in verse 21, he mentions almost the same wording, the things that we put off versus the things that we put on. "Put off concerning your former conversation, your former manner of life," the old life, if you will, "the old man which is corrupt according to the deceitful lust, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind, and that you put on the new man which after God is created in righteousness and true holiness." Then he goes on and expounds on what's under consideration and what he has in mind. Verse 25, "Wherefore putting away lying, speak every man truth with his neighbor, for we are members one of another. Be ye angry, and sin not. Let not the sun go down upon your wrath. Neither give place to the devil. Let him that stole steal no more." He goes all the way down through the end of the chapter, but look at verse 32, how again he summarizes it. "Be ye kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake hath forgiven you." So, again, the exchange principle, if you will, the old man is canceled out by the new man. We put off the old way of thinking, the old way of acting, the old attitude, and put on the new man. And so this morning we're going to emphasize our attitudes and our actions toward one another. We begin with the ones that are difficult, quite honestly, the things that are hindrances to loving one another. Proverbs chapter 23 and verse 7 says, "For as he thinketh in his heart, so is he." As he thinketh in his heart, so is he. So our attitudes, if we put that in terms that the way we would say it today, our attitudes determine our actions, right? And so our thinking process is what determines our attitudes. As he thinketh in his heart, so is he. So our focus, again, will be on these principles and these attitudes and actions as we consider the things that one another commands, if you will, and the ones that are hindrances, the ones that challenge us. I think it's interesting if you look down at the end of the introduction, the negative commands address those things that become hindrances to our fellowship and to loving one another. That's what we'll consider this morning, at least, hopefully, if time allows us, 4 of those. And once again, a reminder, our life together is what's under consideration. But the things how we react, how would we act if we react, how we would act and react, I should say, if we were outside the body of Christ. So it's a great reminder that we are in fellowship with each other. We're in fellowship with Christ, in fellowship with God. All of the things that we've mentioned up to this point, those are the things that we need to be reminded of as we consider the hindrances that come our way, the hindrances, the things that get in our way, if you will, in loving one another. And so wanted to mention those things just really to kind of lay the groundwork for our thoughts this morning and talk about these 4 that are in the outline and consider them. Turn over, if you would, to Romans chapter 14. Romans chapter 14. We're going to talk first about the first example, I should say, is our relationship with a weaker brother. And this is, I believe, an important principle for us, not just because I've chosen it for the outline, but for the application that we can make for you and I in our relationship with a weaker brother. Romans chapter 14, Paul talks to those brethren. Really, if you wanted to summarize chapter 14, he's talking to them about balancing love and liberty. He had talked to them a great deal about their liberty through the gospel, liberty through the truth, liberty through Christ. But there were those who were holding on to the old law, those who were holding on to various things of the old law. And so it required, on the part of the brethren, a balancing act, if you will, in dealing with a weaker brother. Verse 13 of chapter 14 is the key verse that I want us to mention, and this is the one another that is mentioned here. It says, "Let us not therefore judge one another anymore, but judge this rather, that no man put a stumbling block or an occasion to fall in his brother's way." Now, he said that in regard to a weaker brother. He begins the chapter by making the statement, "Him that is weak in the faith receive ye, but not to doubtful disputations." What's under consideration here is matters of opinion. So we're not talking about doctrinal issues. We're talking about matters of opinion. In particular, there were those who were troubled over, as he describes it, doubtful disputations or matters of opinion. Really 2 things that are under consideration. One is the eating of meat that had been offered unto idols. Verse 2, he says, "For one believeth that he may eat all things, and other who is weak eateth herbs." Verse 4, he said, "Who art thou that judgest another man's servant? To his own master he standeth or falleth. Yea, ye shall be holden up, for God is able to make him stand." And so when we think about this, I'm sorry, I read verse 4. It should have been verse 14. Look at verse 14. He said, "I know and am persuaded by the Lord Jesus that there is nothing unclean of itself, but to him that esteemeth anything to be unclean, to him it is unclean." So as we look at this, Paul makes a statement there that there is nothing unclean about the meat, but there are those who have a problem with it. There are those who have a problem with eating of meat that is offered unto idols. There are also those, he says, who esteem one day above another. Verse 5, "One man esteemeth one day above another, another esteemeth every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind." And so we have these 2 matters of opinion, as he describes here, that are under consideration. These 2 doubtful disputations, as he says in verse 1, matters of judgment. So then he gives the admonition, how we are to treat those brethren, the weaker brother. Again, we're talking about differences of opinion, and those who have a concern about a matter of opinion, meat being offered to idols, and the esteeming of a particular day. But notice what the apostle says that we are to do and how we are to consider and to deal with, if you will, this particular situation. What does he say in verse 3? Let him that eateth despise him that eateth not. Let not him, I can't get it out, my eyes are blurry this morning. Let not him that eateth despise him that eateth not, and let not him which eateth not judge him that eateth, for God hath received him. That's a great indication of the attitude, if you will, that we are to have, and he was admonishing these Roman brethren to have toward one who had held to this opinion about the eating of meat that was offered to idols. Not be selfish, not hold them in judgment, not to despise them. That word despise there is a very interesting word when you look at it, and it gives you a really clear view of how we are to hold them. The idea is, according to Vines, to make of no account or to regard them as nothing. Well, what's he saying here? Here's a brother who has a concern about the eating of meat that is offered to idols. And it's a serious concern to that brother. And as his brother, you should not hold him in judgment or to regard it as nothing. It's something that you should be considerate of him about. He also says in verse 10, to judge them not. The idea there is to condemn or to execute judgment. So what is he saying? What is our attitude toward a brother who has a difference of opinion here, or a matter of opinion? It's not something that we should take lightly. It's not something that we should hold him in judgment over. And so it could be selfish on our part to use our liberty to take that lightly, or to consider that to be something of that's not a big deal when it is for this brother. And so, absolutely. Exactly. 1 Corinthians chapter 8, there's another, it's almost the exact same situation, but he speaks it maybe in more clear terms. 1 Corinthians chapter 8, let me find the verse that I'm looking for. Well, you begin in verse 1, really, but he addresses the same issue again. Now, as touching things offered unto idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffeth up, but love edifieth. Here he's telling them, here's the admonition right here. Don't allow your knowledge to make you puffed up or to be arrogant toward this. And if any man think he knoweth anything, he knoweth nothing yet as he ought to know. He goes on down in verse 7. There are those who lack that knowledge. Howbeit there is not in every man that knowledge, for some with conscience of the idol that unto this hour eat it as a thing offered unto an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. That's exactly what's under consideration in Romans 14. But meat commendeth us not to God, for neither if we eat are we the better, neither if we eat not are we the worse. But here's the point that I wanted to make about 1 Corinthians 8. But take heed, he said, lest by any means this liberty of yours become a stumbling block to them that are weak. And so we can cause a weaker brother to stumble to the point where their conscience is defiled. The stumbling block that's under consideration in verse 13 of Romans 14 is an obstacle. But the definition goes further than that. It is a spiritual hindrance, is what he's saying, which leads others to sin or to error. And so when you cause your brother to violate his conscience. That's what he's talking about. That's what the warning is that he gives in 1 Corinthians 8. He goes on back in Romans 14 and verse 7 and tells us that none of us live to himself. We all belong to God. And so our attitude and actions toward a weaker brother are what's under consideration here. So what's the application as we look at this? We're all members one of another. Romans chapter 12 and verse 5. We all will give an account of ourselves. Romans 14 and verse 10, he says, we'll all stand before the judgment seat of God. We are Christ's servants. We live according to his will. I cited in the outline Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20, and 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 10, Christ died for all of us, and we should live for him. I would just simply, by way of reminder, as we look at this, and the final thought on the point is, remember what our fellowship is. It is a relationship, a sharing in common. It is a companionship. And if you remember when we looked at companionship, it is communication between brethren, to be aware and concerned about our brethren. It's also a partnership, a common purpose, a common calling, common objectives. Also a stewardship, a reminder that we belong to God. So when we look at this example, this one another admonition, and the situation that we have about a weaker brother and the opinion that a weaker brother might have, what's the application for us? First, consider love. We love our brother. And so when we find that situation and that comes up, don't consider it something that's a small thing or a light thing. Don't consider it lightly. It's obviously something that is a concern for that brother or sister, whoever it might be. But can you think of examples that would come to mind how we would deal with this situation today? Anything that comes to mind, Matt? There you go.
Sure, I may have to work hard on it, just physically, labor, but this is dealing with their spirituality.
Exactly.
I got to remove myself.
That's exactly right. That's a great example, and you're exactly right. And that's the correct attitude that we are to have toward it. Something that may seem to us very insignificant, something that may seem to us very minor, something that may seem that you wouldn't even think about, maybe, that is an issue for a brother. We need to be considerate of that and concerned about that. And that's what's under consideration here. The example, obviously, is the particular days that were held in high esteem by those, verse 5. Again, not a doctrinal issue, not talking about the Lord's day, but a particular day. And so That's what's under consideration here. And so, again, the application is the attitude and the way that we deal with it, if you will, the way that we not be selfish, but the way that we respond to our brethren in regard to this particular situation. It may be a new convert. It may be someone who is new to the faith and has a particular issue or concern about whatever it may be. We need to be considerate of their feelings and their concerns. You know, we've had that very same issue here at East Huntsville a number of years ago. I can remember, as a matter of fact, we have a wooden cross in the basement right now because it was offensive to someone years ago that we had it in the auditorium. And so it may seem like an insignificant thing, but to one of our brothers it was at that time. And so any other examples that come to your mind? Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. Right. We're going to talk about them in the next point. So, but you're exactly right. You're exactly right. And so, once again, not to overemphasize the point, but our attitude and our action toward those who are legitimately troubled, as Bill said, and how we respond to them. Do we belittle them or do we make light of them because of this? We've had, over another example that comes to my mind, having a meal in the building. We've had that issue come up over years, and there are those who had a problem with that. Are we respectful of that and respectful of what their concern is, or do we ridicule them, or do we make light of them because they choose not to? How we respond to that is so very important. Again, remember what he says when you place a stumbling block in front of your brother, an obstacle, a spiritual hindrance. That's how sober it is. That's how important it is, and that's how he described it. And so, once again, any other thoughts on that particular point? Number 2 is found in Galatians chapter 5. I'd invite you to turn over there, please. And point number 2 and point number 3 will both be taken from Galatians chapter 5, but we have a different hindrance, if you will, or a situation that's under consideration in Galatians chapter 5, verses 13 through 16. Now, I think it's important to consider the context here and consider what Paul is addressing here in Galatians 5. Verse 1, notice what the admonition that he gives. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. He's talking about the liberty of the gospel. But he's also with that, he's issuing an admonition, stand fast in that liberty, but also a warning, be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. Look down then at verse 13. Brethren, you've been called under liberty. Only use not your liberty for an occasion to the flesh, but by love serve one another. For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. But if ye bite and devour one another, take heed that ye be not consumed one of another. This I say then, walk in the Spirit, and ye shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. For the flesh lusteth against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh, and these are contrary the one to the other, so that you cannot do the things that you would. So we have a different consideration here in Galatians chapter 5. We are talking about the issue of circumcision. Bill brought that up just a moment ago in his example. That's what's under consideration here. There were those who were Judaizing teachers, those who were holding on to the old law and holding on to circumcision. And Paul is giving the admonition, hold on to your liberty, the freedom in the gospel. But with that, he says, he gives also an admonition, love is fulfilled in one word, love thy neighbor as thyself. What's under consideration is the one another command in verse 15. But if you bite and devour one another, take heed that you be not consumed one of another. So we're talking about what he says, a reminder, love, serve, walk in the Spirit. But what's under consideration was the direct opposite of that. Internal strife in the church, verse 15. Once again, biting and devouring, being consumed one of another. Things that are reactions, if you will, that are incompatible with the law of love. Exactly. But it gets out of hand, and that's what's under consideration here. So you're exactly right. When you have bitterness and wrath and strife, it gets out of hand. And what happens? Destroys the church. You have disunity. They're out of harmony with one another. The flesh warring against the spirit, verse 17, contrary to one another. It prevents our proper service to the Lord. Bill wrote an article back in 2018 about this particular series of verses. And in that article, he emphasized those things. He emphasized, if you look at these verses, by love, serve one another. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Be not consumed one another. And walk in the Spirit. Those were the points of that particular article. And that summarizes the idea here. Our attitudes and actions toward our brethren. When we bite and devour one another. What's under consideration when you look at those words? Wounding and destroying one another. That's what he says. To bite is to cut or to wound the soul. To devour is to ruin by inflictions or injuries. To consume is what the end will be. Ultimately, the church is destroyed. And so that is the sobering reality of what he's talking about here. And what does he say in verse 17? The result is you cannot do the things that you would do. You can't function as a church. There is no fellowship involved when you're biting and devouring one another. So if you go further, you could carry it a little bit further. The solution, we didn't read beginning in verse 22, but the fruit of the Spirit. What does he say? We crucify the flesh, verse 24. So now we're under consideration of doctrinal issues, right? Not matters of opinion, but doctrinal issues. And so we remember our fellowship, but what's the application? Again, what's the application here? The whole focus, if you read through the entire chapter 5, I think it's 5 times, if I remember correctly, memory slips me a little bit. He emphasizes love, rather than biting and devouring one another. And so things that are not justified by the law, he says in verse 4. So it's a great reminder. Good application for us when we run into differences that take place among us as brethren, how we react. Do we allow things to get out of hand? Do we get to the point where we bite and devour one another? Or do we react with love and remind ourselves that we are serving each other? So I think it's a good point. These are challenges, aren't they? We think about the reality of these things. It'd be easy for us, and sometimes we may even have the tendency to think, well, that doesn't happen. We don't have to deal with those things. But that's not true, is it? We do. The reality is that we do deal with differences of opinions. We do deal with doctrinal issues. We do deal with personalities. All of those are in the church, even as small as East Huntsville. We do deal with those things. And so we have a great lesson on how to respond and how to react, and a great reminder, a great admonition. Focus on love. Number 3, time's going to catch us. We're not going to get finished, but at the end of the chapter, verse 26, he says, "Let us not be desirous of vainglory, provoking one another, envying one another." Really, 2 thoughts here, but they go together. And in simple terms, it is a desire for vainglory. James chapter 4 and verse 16, I didn't include that reference in the outline, but those who are boastful, or rejoice in your boasting, is the admonition that he gives in James chapter 4. If you do a little background study on this verse 26, I think it's interesting because it says essentially what's under consideration here is a desire for vainglory that is based on empty advantages or pride. Property, social status, education, our heritage. That was something that many of the Judaizing teachers in particular took a great deal of pride in, if you will, their heritage, their social status, and all of the things that were of a physical or material nature. What's he admonishing them to do? Those things are not important, he said. The idea, again, is to think that you have some advantage because of these things. Again, it's a great reminder. We put on Christ, we're all the same. Galatians chapter 3, verse 27 and 28, you're familiar with that. Neither Jew nor Greek, bond or free. We're all the same in Christ. These things are of little importance in Christianity and constitute nothing in the way of salvation. They should not be allowed to interfere with our fellowship. Time's going to get us. I apologize, but anyway, we're going to stop right there. We got enough material to probably spend next week on the lesson as well. So thank you for your comments. I appreciate your input. Hold on to that outline, and we'll probably pick up there next week. guys. How y'all?